Yutes Mishnah Vav. We've learned previously that a bris milah is made up of three elements. The first element is the chituch, which is actually known as the milah, the actual cutting away of the orla. Then you have the priya, which means the pulling back of the membrane, and then you have metzitza, which is drawing up the dam. Now we're now discussing the first element, which is the actual chituch itself. And we know that you have to remove the orla. Well, the Mishnah is going to tell us that sometimes the moihel can remove the orla, but there will be what's known as sitzin hama'akvin, little pieces of shred, little bits of the orla, thin shreds of foreskin, which have not been removed. So the shaila is, when are they ma'akev? When is it considered that he's already done the bris milah? And how many of these shreds, how much is left to invalidate the bris milah? That's really the theme of this Mishnah. So says the Mishnah, Elohein tzitzin hama'akvin. These are the shreds which invalidate the milah. Basar hachoife es roiv ha'torah. If there is flesh, i.e. from the foreskin, which covers roiv ha'torah, the majority of the atorah, which is known as the corona of the gid. So the Bartanura explains as follows. Sitzin, kamin neimin shabasa, nimin shabasa, little shreds of flesh, shenisharu min ha'orla, that remain from the foreskin. Atorah, says the Bartanura, he sofa gvoya hamakefes es hagid soviv. Excuse me. Atorah, says the Bartanura, he sofa gvoya hamakefes es hagid soviv, which is the ridge surrounding the membrane, and it sort of tapers down to a point. Says the Bartanura, when you have bits of orla which remain on the gid, lo say merov hekefa, don't say that we're referring to the majority of the circumference of the gid, even if it's the majority of the height in one point, that would be ma'akev, that would invalidate the bris. Now, the my nafkamina, but the big nafkamina would be on Shabbos, because we know that if it's milah, bizmano is doche Shabbos, you can do the milah on Shabbos. But once the moel has done his bris milah, and it's a good milah, then that does not entitle him to be mechal Shabbos anymore. So if the moel does the bris milah, and then he notices that once he sort of pulls away, he notices there are tzitzin hama'akvin, i.e. there are little bits of the foreskin which still remain there. So since he has not yet done bris milah, this child is still considered an oral, he's still uncircumcised, because there are tzitzin which are ma'akev the milah, they invalidate the milah. He has to go back, and he's allowed to, and he should go back and remove those tzitzin hama'akvin on Shabbos, because just like he had the sort of the green light, the entitlement, the heter to do the milah on Shabbos in the first place, so he should remove the tzitzin hama'akvin if he left them there. If, however, there are tzitzin which are not ma'akev, tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin, then once he's moved his hands away and he's finished the bris, and then he notices tzitzin which are not ma'akev, they're very small sort of shreds of flesh there, then he should not go back and do those. During the week he should, because it's a hidur mitzvah, because it sort of beautified the mitzvah, but on Shabbos he's not entitled to do so. If, however, he's still engaged in the actual bris milah, then the green light is still there, as it were, and he would be able to remove all the tzitzin without any problem. But once he's sort of pulled away from it, then he shouldn't. And if a person, continues the Mishnah, has got tzitzin hama'akvin, therefore he has not had a proper bris milah, and he's considered an oral, uncircumcised, he is not allowed to eat truma. Why not? So it says the Bartanura, in Kohen, if this person is a Kohen, and he can normally eat truma, to Kohen oral osalechel b'truma, a Kohen who is uncircumcised cannot eat truma. Why? How do we know this? Nema b'Pesach, it says with regard to Korban Pesach, Toishev v'socher lo yechel boy v'nema b'truma, Toishev Kohen v'socher lo yechel boy, ma Pesach osel la'oral, af truma asur la'oral. Just as an oral, an uncircumcised person, cannot eat and partake of the Korban Pesach, so too an oral cannot eat and partake of truma. Excuse me. Continues the Mishnah. Ve'im hoya ba'al bosa. If the person having the bris milah is large, is fat, is plump, then there is a chashash, we're worried, that says the Bartanura, that hoya ba'al bosa, hoya shomeinu nira bosa shelamal meralosai. Some of the flesh above the orla sort of drops down, even though he's had the bris and he's removed the moil, has removed the orla, but some of the sort of the fleshy skin drops down, it sort of gives the appearance that he hasn't yet had bris milah. So then, he should fix it, he should remedy it because of maras ayin. Says the Bar Tanura, you cut away diagonally using an izema, using the knife, just to, or you tie it back. There are various ways of being masakin what the person has done. Okay. They play maras ayin. Says the Bar Tanura, they shouldn't look, give the appearance that he's uncircumcised. Concludes the Mishnah. Mol v'lo pora es hamila kilu mol. We mentioned earlier that there are 3 stages. The second stage of a bris milah is priya. Priya means after you've done the chituch, you pull back the membrane. Now if you don't do that priya, mol v'lo pora, if you do the milah, the chituch, cutting away the orla, but you don't do the second stage of removing, of pulling back the membrane, then ki'ilu lo mol, it's as if you haven't done the milah. And therefore, says the Bar Tanura, ki'ilu lo mol v'yoshav v'pora, you should got to go back and you've got to do the priya again. Va'afilu silek yodem imenu, even though it's Shabbos, let's say, and you've moved your hands back from it, and therefore you think you've done the milah, but if you haven't done priya, then it's as if you haven't done the milah. So therefore you've got to go back and you've got to do the priya. And concludes the Bar Tanura, v'chol shehu misasek b'milah b'Shabbos, so long as he's involved, he's engaged in the mitzvah of milah on Shabbos, chotech bein tzitzin hamagvin bein tzitzin shein menakvin, then he's allowed, as we mentioned earlier, to cut away whether they're tzitzin which are ma'akev or not ma'akev, whether they invalidate the milah by leaving them there, or whether they don't. So long as he's engaged in the milah, he's allowed to. Once he's removed his hands away, and as if it were the red light is on, he can no longer be mechal Shabbos, so then, al tzitzin hama'akvin choyze, he's only allowed to go back and cut away the tzitzin hama'akvin, because that invalidates the milah. However, al tzitzin she'ein ma'akvin ein choyze, if tzitzin which are not ma'akiv, then he cannot go back and remove those. That is the end of the 6th Mishnah and the end of Perek Yud Tes.